Okay, so now let's go back to, we went to the beginning of the Washington Consensus. Let's go to the end, because your main current work now is on the consensus that followed the Washington Consensus, which you call the Wall Street Consensus. So, considering that you both see them as being part of the general, I would say, neoliberal epistemological outlook, and with its political consequences, what do you see as the continuities, the shifts in the premise, in the expectation, and the tools that are distinctive of the two consensus? So that we did the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, what are the events that you would say would precipitate the change from one to another? I mean, we can think, of course, of the subprime banking crisis of 2008, you mentioned that, but also maybe the Eurozone crisis of 2011-12, the emergence of the Paris Agreement in 2016, the COVID pandemic, and so forth. So both structurally, how do they differ and how do they resemble each other? And historically, how do we get from one to the other?
Very good. So the Wall Street Consensus is, just to define it very quickly, is a substantive shift in state capital relations from the age of the Washington Consensus, in which the state assumes overtly a more transformative role, as in the state has to asks questions about what needs to be transformed in the economy in order for us to weather a crisis, whether it's a climate crisis, whether it's a geopolitical crisis, whether it's a competitiveness crisis. So the state, unlike the Washington Consensus, accepts that it has to play a more explicit role, but it is hindered in answering that question of, or he has to ask the question, how do we pay for transformation? I think that's a very important question that comes over and over again in whatever kind of state project that envisages a bigger role for the state. And when it asks how to pay for transformation, then the answer in the Wall Street Consensus is private finance. The answer is private finance. If you think about Keynes's kind of reflection that anything we can do, we can pay for, which was his argument that we can arrange the institutions of the state, the macro institutions of the state, in a way that allows us to pay for transformation. In the Wall Street Consensus, this Keynesian premise becomes anything we can do, private finance will pay for. And you could see it in many different ways, in many different contexts. The first time I observed it as a consensus, and I will talk a bit more about what I think is a fundamental discontinuity or difference, which is the kind of state project that each consensus has at its core, or the political imaginary and the role that it assigns to the state is fundamentally different. But the first time I noticed it as a consensus is in 2015, not with climate, but with the Sustainable Development Goals in international development, where for the first time the World Bank says very clearly, and not just the World Bank, but the United Nations Conference on financing for development that takes place every 10 years. In 2015, the private finance becomes a critical ally or partner in delivering the Sustainable Development Goals, in delivering financing for development. So that's the first time that this consensus is articulated publicly, where there is the rhetoric of a partnership becomes very important. So now we are making, the Wall Street Consensus makes it explicit that in order to achieve any kind of significant transformation, you need the state to partner with private capital, because the state has transformative ambitions, but it doesn't have the money because of fiscal restrictions. Private capital has the money, and here the trillions of shadow banks or asset managers, those trillions become a very important kind of part of the narrative of transformation. Those trillions by themselves will not go into the places where the state would like them to go. So there is a kind of institutional, not failure, but an institutional lack within the state, that it cannot generate public fiscal resources. That's the narrative of the Wall Street Consensus, that the state cannot generate significant fiscal resources, and the private sector cannot generate sufficient returns for the transformative ambitions of the state. So the logic of the partnership is there is a redistribution of risks from the private sector to the state, in which the state basically makes it more attractive for private capital to invest in the priorities that the state has identified, like development, then it becomes climate, then it becomes industrial policy, then it becomes armament. All of these new areas of that the state, new transformative ambitions that the state accumulates as, the global economy changes. The Wall Street Consensus says private finance can deliver if there are partnerships, investability partnerships or bankability partnerships with the state. And I would say, I don't usually call it a neoliberal project, the Wall Street Consensus, because of the way in which it reimagines the role of the state as an important economic and political actor. If you will remember, the Washington Consensus at its core, although in practice it was very different, but at its core, in its ideology, it was an anti-state project. It assumed, you can think about the way in which the Republicans and Ronald Reagan, and then Ronald Reagan and then the Republicans during the Clinton era always accused the Democrats of wanting big government. The Washington Consensus had a specific obsession with big government, and rolling back big government in its many manifestations was critical, right, to achieving a market-led order. I would say that's how they described. Whereas in the Wall Street Consensus, the state comes back, and it comes back as a legitimate economic actor, but not in the old Keynesian sense. It is a state that is all guided by the question, how do I make nature or education or infrastructure, housing, health, how do I make them investable for private capital? This is the role of the state, and I call this project the de-risking state, which has more ambitions, which is allowed now is to re-enter economic life, but on very specific terms and in a very specific relationship with private capital. So it's not neoliberal in that sense, but where it preserves the fundamental pillars of neoliberalism, and that's where I think again critical macrofinance is useful, because it forces us to look at the neoliberal pillars put in place by macroeconomic pillars put in place by neoliberalism, which is an independent central bank targeting inflation and a treasury conducting fiscal policy, always either under the discipline of the central bank or under the discipline of the bond vigilantes, of the investors who buy and sell government bonds with a view of the long-term fiscal health of the spending plans or the taxation plans of the government. So the Wall Street Consensus brings back the state, but it doesn't fundamentally transform the macroeconomic institutions of the state from the neoliberal era, and in many ways it accelerates some of the dynamics of the neoliberal state, particularly the social contract around welfare provision and pensions with the state.